rest of the world. Where's Soul? Where's Soul? I think before we begin, just in case there's anyone else still on the way to arrive, are we?
There might be Jan Marilyn, but she said that she might be called up to work. Yeah. So that she's the only one.
I get to see everyone except Mary, who's directly behind the screen. So she just sees the top of his head or something, maybe, but we do see quite a lot of each other, so it doesn't matter too much. I just wanted to begin with the absolute obvious. It's just kind of sharing the merit and the delight that particularly Stephen and Mary and myself are feeling as a result of all these months of start, stop, little bit of difficulty, correction made, backing and forthing, and finally, ta-da-da! It's the real McCoy. and this kind of wonderful cover, I don't know if you can see it out there, right? Which was done by Elizabeth Guttridge, and in a way, the cover ended up expressing very much a feeling of this approach, and I thought it perfectly murmurated. Thank you, David and Randall, right? Who this morning sent me a link to, I think it was a Danish photographer who did some beautiful photography and videography of starlings, right, flying in gigantic, dense clusters, murmuration they call it, right? And you see these, I mean, we've seen this, I can remember very much seeing this in Africa and in the kind of deep outback of Australia. I've seen this. And it's almost like, swirling smoke, right? Except it's made up of hundreds of thousands of birds. And they're all kind of flying with each other and swirling, and there's kind of, it's like a pointillist artwork in space, right? And so when you get a lot of points together, it becomes very dense and black against the, usually, I mean, when you're looking at it, you're seeing it against the sky. And so you're seeing it against this very light sky, and then, and so it's just, our cover's like that. It kind of swirls, and I mean, it's maybe a little too subtle to show on the screen, but there's swirlings and so on. And there's huge speculation of like, how do they know how to do this? And, right? I mean, this is amazing. Like, this is like all these birds, they all move as one, right? But I would like to suggest to you that you have to listen very, very carefully and deeply to this class, because I'm only going to murmur. I'm going to murmurate. I'm going to, right? Actually, what these starlings are demonstrating is what each one of us is all the time. Mm-hmm. And the reason why we're so sort of boggled by it is because we bring to the question this kind of absolutely unquestioned assumption that basically all these creatures act as individual units, and we can't see how on earth they can cooperate. But perhaps we might be able to learn a different way of being. So let's sit together, and I don't think you'll be able to watch yourself murmurate. I don't know if I'm using this word correctly, but it's just, I mean, the emails, there's always synchronicities that are happening, right? And I kind of, this morning I wake up and I thought, how on earth is this class going to unfold? And I'm not kind of worried and speculating, I'm just kind of looking, because I know something's coming in, and all of a sudden it will be unfolding. Mm-hmm. Okay? And lo and behold, David and Randall sent off this email. And I looked at the cover of the book. So let's sit together for a few moments and see if you can, in a sense, it's a very simple image, but fall open. Okay? I mean, we sometimes talk about flowering, so it's like they're flowering. And you could still easily get into this idea that I'm flowering, or they are flowering. But actually, you imagine you're just sitting there and all of a sudden you just discover yourself falling open. It's an absolute effortless, it's not you doing it, it's just you stop, you're trying to hold yourself together, right? And you could fall open. And imagine like the whole of our being falling open. Our cells, our tissues, our organ systems, our thinking, our conceptualizing. The whole thing just relaxes into spacious openness. And if you need to have something to do while this is taking place, try breathing. Smiling and breathing and presenting. This book's full of smiling, breathing, present. But I'd like to change it all now. Sorry, edit book. And whenever you see present, go presenting. Right? This is like it's a process. Okay? So we're smiling and we're breathing and presenting. This present, presenting. Now this, now that. Falling open, spacious and open. And appreciate the dancing of your experience. All sorts of different perceptions. Right? Seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, tasting, thinking. Thoughts are just perceptions in a way. It's a type of perception. Seeing is a perception, no different. They're just perceptions. Remembering. speculating. And in a way, all these different layerings of process are all kind of responding and shifting in response to each other. We take refuge in this multi-dimensional ground of becoming. We take refuge in spacious openness and engaged presence, the nature and activity of this ground. We take refuge in this planet-wide communion of life unfolding. May we actively cultivate generosity, wholesome relating, patience, skilled use of energy, a continuity of caring and inquiry, and profound understanding. May all beings realize their true interbeing nature for the sake of everything and everyone. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. It's a curious thing, these gatherings. Can you hear me when I'm not hollering, right? Yes, out there? Thank you. Good. Sometimes I think, well, why should we bother? Because I don't have anything fresh to say. I just say the same thing again and again, right? I've been saying the same thing, similar things again and again for decades. It must be terribly boring. Right? But I'm hoping that somehow coming together and remembering, right? Coming together and remembering what is important. And, you know, in a sense, last time we gathered, I was talking about confidence and competence, and using that kind of phrase, right? Each being dwells in a state of competence and confidence, but not necessarily what your ego thinks of competence and confidence. I mean, what I mean is it's like the habitual ways of being. You're very competent at that. I mean, this is outside of your decision. Right? This is the kind of, the type of living that you are. And you also have a confidence, that the competence is the kind of the ability to do, and the confidence is the mental sense of knowing that you're very likely to be able to do this. Okay? So you might have a competence and confidence in that you are a separated individual, trying as best you can to collaborate with a whole lot of other separated individuals to bring about peace on earth. Okay? Yeah, this might be, it's kind of, it's almost like an invisible set of assumptions that's ingrained into your muscles, into your neurons, into your functioning. Right? This confidence, competency that I'm talking about. And in a sense, we begin the path of awakening when we somehow feel drawn to be curious about the confidence and competency that we have, instead of just accepting it. Now this kind of deep assumption of individuality of the universe provokes a lot of difficulty. I mean, we've got horrific wars going on in the world today. And there is a huge, genuine feeling of yearning for peace on the part of many beings. Okay? We want to kind of meditate for peace in the Ukraine, or we want to bring peace on earth. And you know, Thich Nhat Hanh, in his very simple way of putting things, once said, well, if you really want peace, peace is with you now. Live peacefully. And so, you know, I was thinking, could we see if we can remember something which is so part and parcel of our living that we often don't even know how to frame it up in words, and hence we don't really know how to talk about it well. I wonder if some of our verbalizing attempts in our meditation are actually very reasonable experiments in how to communicate with words this ineffable experience of existing, so that we can share what is most valuable with us, for us, with others, which is a perfectly reasonable thing. I mean, how do all these birds connect? Years ago, I got very intrigued and engaged with the writings of Arthur Koestler, who's virtually unheard of today. He's kind of drifted off the map. Right? And he coined I think he coined the phrase or the word, but maybe he got it from someone else. And he introduced the possibility of holons. Right? And he described a holon as being something which is simultaneously a whole and a part. I don't mean a part in the sense you're apart from it, you're separate, but you're a part, a component of a whole. Okay? And he was trying to point out in many of his writings how every living being is a holon. And actually, if you look, you see holons within holons within holons. Okay? We have this kind of sense of embeddedness. Okay? I mean, we could see that in a way, if we look at our bodies. I mean, this body, this thing that I call a body, right? If you have the opportunity to look, you'll see that it's more than just what you see in the mirror. Right? It's got kind of all sorts of different densities of juices in it. Thick juices and runny juices and different colored juices too. Right? And it's got all kinds of fatty bits and stretchy bits and hard bits and so on. And we look even further and we see that they're made up of cells. And the cells are made up of extraordinarily vast, complex networkings of murmurations of molecules. Like everything is kind of dancing in response with everything else. Right? And even the individual molecules themselves are networks of atoms. Because if you look at, for example, you might have a polymer in the cell, right, a DNA kind of strand or something like that. It doesn't just kind of sit there like a component of the cell, a part, and together they make the whole of the cell. But the part itself could be considered a whole because atoms are joining in and going away, and it's constantly transforming. Right? It's, in fact, if you look at it, there's kind of nothing there of any kind of duration at all. Okay? We have a kind of a holon, right? Networks within networks within networks. Networks of atoms make networks of molecules, make networkings of cells, make networkings of tissues, make networkings of organs, make networkings of organ systems, right? And then whole networkings of human beings, like, you know, that these individual starlings, I mean, we think, wow, that's amazing, seeing all these smoky starlings, right, swirling around like smoke. But imagine, just for a moment, right, consider the possibility that each one of these starlings has a heart. I bet you lots of people look at the murmuration, as wonderful as it is, all this swirling smoke, and not once do they see millions of beating hearts all swirling around each other. Right? And they don't see millions of kind of photon and retinal responses as eyeballs in these moving birds, right, are constantly shifting and changing with the shifts and changes of their other buddies. Okay? I mean, we can get this with poetry and we can get this intuitively, and yet we live with this competence and confidence that actually we're individual units. We meditate with competence and confidence as being in. What would it mean to have competence and confidence, deepening competence and confidence in our kind of holonic nature? You know, the ancient Buddhists, particularly in the Mahayana tradition, tried to name this constantly, where the whole thing is just a big attempt to try and name things. It's parikalpita all over the place. Just kind of crude, lumpy names. You look at this dancing network and you say, cell. Right? This is absolutely incredible. Right? And we're doing this all the time, but we do this, right? But imagine all these kind of networkings moving. And the ancients tried to kind of name the kind of most salient network that we experience, namely this network we call me. Right? And, you know, because Tarchin was just so kind of obsessed with Tarchin and constant, you know, Tarchin this, Tarchin that, they said, no, you're not really Tarchin. You're bodhisattva. right? So at least then we started to get a sense of a general class of dancing, awakening, falling open, networks within networks of beingness, sattva, being, bodhying, right? And the other day, I again, we're networking, and I'm not just talking about the internet, obviously, but I am, because David and Randall sent me these emails. I was the internet, right? But also through the internet, right? I was offered a word, right? Which I'm not sure if I'd come across before, but I thought, that's perfect. Right? And they were describing someone who was deeply involved in kind of ecological activism, right? As a true eco-sattva. Right? And I thought, eco-sattva, bodhisattva. We're eco-sattvas. Right? This is why we're eco-sattvas. Think of it, right? This is eco-sattvas. And, sometimes we get a feeling for this. And as, you're kind of opening up, there's inner networkings and there's outer networkings within networkings. If you're very sensitive, you start to feel how extraordinary responsive the whole thing can be. And that there's other days when you're not so sensitive, when you're more kind of clunky and lumpy. Right, that you're not sensitive and responsive to much at all, right? Maybe just a very, very local kind of community. Right? Can you imagine? I mean, those birds were moving really, really fast. So it's very hard to kind of see the individual behaviors of any individual birds. That's not their mystery. That's my limitation. Right? But could you imagine the possibility that while they were flying around, one of them got an itchy shoulder? I mean, this is goofy. I mean, you don't usually think about this. They're not actually real beings with feelings and hopes and fears and interests and competencies and confidences, right? Imagine this bird hanging out with 6 or 7 other good friends. And they're kind of just flying, right? But some of our friends overlap. Have you noticed that? I have a friend, and you have the same friend, but then that friend is overlapping with some other friend. But you have some friends that I don't have friendship with, kind of thing. Okay? But I've got my immediate kind of community that I work with. Namely 100 trillion cells encapsulated inside my skin. And they're all dancing and swirling, right? And unfolding. And gradually, some observer steps outside and goes, oh, it's arching and growing. Right? You have to step outside the cloud of birds to see the patterns in the sky. Okay? I wonder if the birds are just having I wonder if birds are having bird pleasure, right? Of moving harmoniously with each other, dancing with each other. Humans can enjoy dancing with each other and making music with each other, moving harmoniously with each other. But birds they're just animals. They wouldn't have feelings of pleasure. My memory too was that they were chirping like crazy when they were doing this. It was kind of like a huge pile of sound as well as visual swirlings. Hey, how you doing? Yeah. Hey. And then all of a sudden something goes, it shifts, maybe the light changes. Why? Every time I've seen it, it's been at dusk. Or, that kind of time of the day. And then the light changes, and then all of a sudden clumps of them go down into trees and start roosting for the night. And we come together as human beings, right, for activities, and then we come apart and we roost, right, for a period of time. Imagine for a moment you started to have a confidence and competency that you were a Holon in participating in a planet-wide interbeing of life unfolding. Imagine that was your kind of baseline. Everyone's meditating like crazy to try and realize this, but I would like to suggest the possibility that we use this as a starting point. And then we begin with that in mind, we start to investigate, right? Is there a kind of a way of living for eco-sattvas that would support us being more attuned to this? I mean, I think we all appreciate somehow being reminded or being reminded, right, of this attunement. Reminded that we are part of community. Right? This is deeply meaningful for humans. I suspect it's deeply meaningful in their own way for starlings. Sometimes the conditions are such and you get all these individual cells, dictyostelium, slime molds, right? And they're kind of like cruising all over the surface of plants and dirt and rock and dead wood and stuff like that. And then, not the sun goes down and then they roost, but maybe it dries up and the sources of yummy nutriment energy start to kind of change. And so all of a sudden, each being starts changing a little bit and they start saying, "Hi, I'm here, are you there? Hi," or, chemically, right? And they start to clump together and they start to move as one big slimy mass. They call it slime mold, right? And it kind of grows like an amoeba, right? It's almost like a communal being, right? Sliding around, and then it gets together, and together they construct this gigantic sort of, I always think it was a golf tee with a golf ball on the top, or a water tower or something. You got this stem and then a big ball on the top, right? And then some of them are starting to kind of dance with each other in slightly different ways. The whole thing is like everyone's just kind of doing what they do. When somebody comes to the door now, somebody in here is going to stop paying attention to me and look at the door and maybe go out. Mary will go and invite them in. When there's a change, then suddenly there's a change. But then we would all change in response to Mary going over to do this. Maybe the class would stop. Right? Everything's kind of filtering through, right? This, and we're kind of, think of yourself as a smoke being rather than a clearly defined being. You think of clarity and clear perception and direct seeing, and what you really mean is you want your competency at hard edging everything to take precedence. And maybe nothing has a hard edge if we look at it in a certain way. It's permeable. Okay? This is like wonderful, but it's absolutely challenging to our culture. It's not the way we see things. People come to Dharma, they want hard-edged Dharma. Right? You do this practice, I call it allopathic Dharma. Right? Take this meditation, get rid of your fear. Take this meditation, deal with your pain. Take this meditation, bring out peace. Right? It's just an absolute perfect setup for feeling miserable. I do peace, 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 and there's more war, 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 war. I'm a failure. Okay? But maybe, I wonder if we could live in such a way that would synergize each other so that each one of us can be an invitation to each other to remember our kind of eco-sattva nature. At the beginning of what possibly is one of the oldest Buddhist meditation manuals, right? The Visuddhimagga. And I've quoted this many times. There's a little kind of lead in at the very beginning of this very large book, and it's almost like a mythical scene, and a kind of an angel or a dewa or radiant being or something like that, whatever you want to call it, appears before the Buddha. And he asks the Buddha this question. He says, the inner tangle and the outer tangle, this generation is entangled in a tangle. So pray, Gautama, who can untangle this tangle? And this really touched me deeply when I first came across it, and it's touched me deeply over the years. And reflecting on it now, I realized that I continuously looked at this tangle like it was a problem. Oh, you're all tangled up inwardly, and we're all tangled up outwardly, and it's a big tangle. But imagine for a moment that actually it was just a lousy translation. Imagine for a moment the Dewa appears to the Buddha and said, the inner networking and the outer networking, this process of generating the universe is a networking of networkings. So pray, Gautama, who can move in harmony with this networkings of networkings? And then the 1700 pages comes, but the Buddha realized that it would be probably more skillful to give a rather succinct answer first, because if people had to wait to the end of the 1700 pages, a lot of people wouldn't make it. So he sort of just gives you the whole thing, and he said, well, basically a being who is cultivating Sila, Samadhi, and Prajna, right, is able to do this. Think of it now, please. Maybe this isn't what the Visuddhimagga meant. Maybe this is not what happened. I'm not sure that a Dewa would have appeared and asked this thing anyway, right? But entertain this as a kind of a fresh way of thinking, right? Like, who can see clearly and dance skillfully with the inner networkings, right? And outer networkings, right? And the inner networkings of the cell and the outer networkings of all the rest of the cells, and the inner networkings of the organ and the outer networking of the rest of the body, and the inner networking of the body, speech, and mind of the individual, and the outer networking of all the other body, speeches, and minds. Right? Imagine murmurations within murmurations within murmurations. Imagine we had this. If David Attenborough was able to live longer, he would continue. Maybe he would continue his pioneering work of inspiring, the techies to invent ever more spectacular forms of photography, so that we could actually begin to look at individual, we could, just like we can now photograph like murmurations of starlings, we could maybe look into the body and see murmurations of glucose, right? Or hemoglobin, right? Or, like what's going on, the electrical discharges, right, in the kind of complex rhythmic beating of the heart, right? I mean, and we would see murmurations within murmurations within swirlings and dancings and so on. And when you're feeling really good, the whole thing is dancing well. There's a definition of suffering, never mind, suffering, the whole thing. It's like not dancing well is suffering. How do we dance well? That the inner networkings and the outer networkings, this continual process of generation is a networkings of eco-sattvas within eco-sattvas within eco-sattvas, right? It's like ecology was supposed to be the study of home. Okay? This is like the study, the ology of home, economics, right? Right? It was like it was, and so home. What is your home? Now, is your home? I would suggest, in one sense, that your home is deeply connected with this really subtle assumption, competency you have about what's going on. And you declare that to be home. And everything else is a bit kind of unknown. I'm not sure about that because I kind of know this. You know, it's like when COVID came along and it was very widespread conversation in the media about when we will get back to normal. Home. Normal is home. Right? We can get back to normal. You know, the munitions industry, armaments industry, lots of oil smoothly flowing into our gas tanks, lots of carbon smoothly flowing into the atmosphere. Normal. Right? Normality. Normality is home. Okay? And the incredible thing is that this is a kind of, each one of our normalities could be seen as a holon. It's a whole in itself. This is my life. Or this is the life I live in, right? But it's also a part. And the problem with, the difficulty with Kussler's presentation was that I think it tended to be a very kind of linear thing. It's almost like smaller parts inside bigger parts, right? But actually, in a sense, we have bigger parts, like the whole universe is part of my being. When the weather changes, my blood pressure changes, my skin texture changes. Right? There's the dimensions aren't, you know, we got the big in the small and the small in the big parts, and we're intuiting there are convenient holes. Right? We have kind of confidence and competency in having holes. With this in mind, how do you approach Dharma practice? What is Dharma practice? What actually do you mean by Dharma practice? You know, at the beginning we had this refuge prayer. I take refuge in the multi-dimensional ground of becoming. But you know, we could change it and just go something like, refuge, true refuge, is the multi-dimensional ground of becoming. True refuge is the spacious openness and engaged presence. It's not just a kind of an openness, but it's that openness is made of engagement, right? Spacious openness and engaged presence, the nature and activity of this ground of interbecoming. This multi-dimensional, myriad domains and dimensions of being. Okay? I mean, maybe before we sat down and tried to focus on our breath, or try to not have a wandering mind, or deal with this problem, maybe it would be really deeply valuable to have moments where we could genuinely just sit down into the fullness of the living that is currently taking place with a kind of curiosity of what of being more sensitive to this, of being more engaging into the murmuration of this. Smiling, breathing, constantly presenting. Buddha said, like cultivating Sila, Samadhi and Prajna, Sila is really talking about the whole domain of you, Eco-sattva, right? And an Eco-sattva Holon, right? The individual is the Eco-sattva, and the biocracy is the whole, right? The community, the communion of all life is this kind of whole, and the Eco-sattva is the individual, right? It's kind of, we're Holons within this, right? And so this question of like wholesome relating, right? How can we relate in ways that deeply and profoundly support the wholeness? Okay? Liver wholeness, kidney wholeness, right? Not just human wholeness, not just, we want wholeness in the free world, and the rest of the world, what we'll do is we'll cut them off. We'll cut them off from the world economy, right? We'll cut everybody off. We'll have nothing to do with them. We'll defeat them. We'll starve them to death because they're starving us, trying to starve us to death. Us versus them. How on earth can we possibly, and meanwhile you go out at night and look at the stars and realize for a moment we're on a tiny little globe that's spinning through space and we're doing this together. Right? Wholesome relating, right? In a way that we relate in a way that somehow facilitates the greatest possibility of sensitivity of wholeness. Right? In all the people, all the beings, all the things that are meeting. Can I engage with you in a way that invites a deepening appreciation of wholeness? That's wholesome relating. And as I kind of jokingly, tongue-in-cheekly say sometimes, it's just wholesome relating. I mean, be humble. It's somewhat in the direction of whole. It's, it'd be presumptuous to say whole relating. But it's like, can you feel this? Can you feel, if you can't actually feel, when you feel more kind of whole and complete, compared to when you feel more fragmented and incomplete, you haven't got a chance at beginning Dharma. You haven't even knocked on the door. This is nothing profound. Everyone's got the same kind of feeling, right? Completeness is a Mars bar. Completeness is having a kind of a new kind of BMW electric vehicle. Completeness is having this kind of shampoo, right? Or this kind of perfume, or this kind of house in a particular suburb. Completeness, right? And it's just like, be ordinary for a moment. But is that enough? Okay? So Sila, wholesome relating, right? Samadhi is the whole range of skills in focused, engaged attentiveness. Okay? So there's a swimming of, and by the way, the Sila is affecting the Samadhi, and the Samadhi is affecting the Sila. Right? They're not really separate. They're just kind of ways of defining or delineating. And Prajna is a kind of an intuitive, a kind of deepening intuition of wholeness, wisdom. Now this answer of the Buddha to the Deva, right? This is a being who develops Sila, Samadhi, and Prajna. The Eco-sattva who develops Sila, Samadhi, and Prajna. Such a being would untangle the tangle, it said. But I would say such a being would appreciate and ever more deeply engage in the networkings of networkings. Right? We start to identify that is what I don't even have to think of it. This is not some kind of profound spiritual realization. It's just what's going on. It's as ordinary as ordinary. But somehow we need to come to the place where it ceases to be like a concept of like, oh, something that's wonderful, but then the rest of my life is this. It's like this kind of oscillation between forgetfulness and remembering. It becomes kind of maybe more frequent, sped up, right? So that you're kind of in it, and then you're out of it, and in it again, out of it, in it. And you have many, many tastes of the day of remembering. Okay? And you even remember that you're now not remembering. Well, the years went by from the writing of the Visuddhimagga. And people were investigating the world. And in the process, they were starting to see more and more detail. Can you imagine such a thing? 200 years ago, people didn't have a clue about the circulation of the blood. They didn't know about cells. They didn't know about... Our universe is massively bigger now than ever before without changing its size a bit. And so it's no different. So here are these beings really throwing themselves into learning to harmonize Sila, Samadhi and Prajna in their living with others. Right? And gradually the Sila side, which was kind of more like how I'm relating, started to proliferate and open up and and become more. Right? And gradually the Sila kind of slid itself into 4 things. Right? Instead of having the 3, we then had the 6. Okay? And the Sila got divided up into generosity, wholesome relating, patience, and skilled use of energy. Okay? And then Samadhi and Prajna. Okay? And it became kind of a way of speaking in Buddhist teaching that this was seen as the path or the way of life of a bodhisattva. But now we're no longer saying bodhisattva because it's become loaded with projection and so on. We now know it's an eco-sattva. Right? Trouble with that is, the next thing you know, you think it's just someone who's just chronically out there walking up and down on the street holding signs. Right? Don't do this, don't do that. Right? Or whatever. So we're not talking about that. But a sense of being home. Could you imagine for a moment, the eco-sattva surely is going, the bodhisattva sometimes might invoke a sense of flowering and budding, and so you go somewhere through your flowering. You're kind of going somewhere. Animals can obviously go somewhere, but plants, when they go somewhere, they have to grow somewhere. They can't just sort of lift up their thing and trot off like an ant at night. Their roots go out further, or their branches go out further, and they go around an obstacle, or they crack the obstacle open. The plants move, but it's different than animals. Right? But you have a sense of going somewhere, and this is another confidence, competency that we have, an assumption that basically the universe is in a universe with individual lumps. We have space and distance between lumps. It kind of goes with that. And this idea that I want a mental space as well. I want to go from this unawakened space and I'm going to go to this awakened space. But you see, in eco-sattva would be just a thorough homebody. I mean, you can't find out about home by leaving home. If you want to know about jungles, you got to go to a jungle and stay in the jungle. If you want to know about oceans, you got to go into the ocean and stay in the ocean. And if you want to know about home, you've got to recognize where home is and stay there. Learning, studying, experimenting, playing, murmurating. Okay? And imagine for a moment that we start having this kind of extraordinary wacky idea. It's wacky when you try to describe it to a friend who's not thinking about these things, right? But your true home is in the very midst of the living that you are. You never leave home. Huh? I mean, I used to, when I became ordained as a monk, it was kind of all the thing in those days to refer to ourselves as homeless ones, you know, and my mother's parting gift for her wayward son who'd sort of drifted off the edge of reality and become a monk, right, was to give me a suitcase. It was just kind of accepting this, you know. She gave me a suitcase and I opened it up and she'd stuck inside, this was back in the early 70s, so you know, this was rather a fresh picture. We're all blasé about it now. But it was that first picture of planet Earth taken from the lunar, you know, the Apollo program, right? And it was just a very simple black picture, and then the Earth just floating there in black, and then at the bottom it said, home. Right? My mother was a great, wise guru, she's right? And so we begin to find ourselves home, right? Not home in the Ukraine or home in Russia or home in Gaza or home in Jerusalem or home in New Zealand or home in the middle class or home in human beingness or home in the networkings of livings that we are. Right? And it's like an extraordinary thing, because when we realize that we don't have any option here, that this is not an optional thing. You know, it doesn't matter, you know, you can forget this and you can go off and make bedlam and ruckus wherever you go, and I say you're still living in the fullness of the living that you are. Right? But could we somehow recognize that to a degree there is a possibility of us intentionally participating in this with the aspiration to do it well? And so in meditation we sit down into the fullness of the living that we are. Why sit down? You could just be running like mad in the fullness of the living that you are, or lying on your back, or floating on the water, or, right? The posture, this sitting down business is sometimes a little misleading, but the sense of like sitting down into the fullness of the living that you are, and then beginning to recognize this kind of Sila Samadhi Prajna, or as they talked about in the Mahayana tradition, they talked about the 6-parami, the 6 perfections, because by living in this way we perfect our capacity for Eco-sattva-ing. Maybe this would be all right. We could, if we just got rid of Eco-sattva and bodhisattva and replaced it with bodhisattva-ing and Eco-sattva-ing, or, right? Whatever you prefer, right? But a sense of just reminding ourselves again and again that it's a process, and that the edge of this process is defined by the subtlety of the seeing that's looking at it. When I look at it in a certain way, I say the edge of this process is my skin. When I look at it in another, it is Sangha. community. Okay? And when I look at it in here, wow, the community of all, right? The team of 5 million, right? And I could get really kind of wrapped and engaged in that kind of dimension, and at that moment kind of subtly, unintentionally become a little less appreciative of all sorts of inner whole. And it's a whole that's made up of, each part that makes up the whole is itself a whole. Right? There's holes within holes within holes. And so we have this by living this way, we begin to kind of, I'm not sure that I like this term. They translated parami as perfection sometimes, paramita. But in the sense that it can perfect our being. It thoroughly makes, right? We're participating in the making of our being, a thorough making of being. And, you know, the first perfection is Dana-parami. And when I say the first, I just mean they go and list it. It's really hard to, like, imagine for a moment they took all the books in the world and impressed them all onto a little point the size of a full stop at the end of a sentence. I can imagine they could do that nowadays, you know, with kind of micro whatever. Right? But you'd never be able to read it. It would just look like black dot. Right? Of course, you magnify it, and up comes all the texts, right, of the world traditions and so on. All the writings come out of that, right? But you sit down and it just becomes a dot, right? And so we don't. We kind of pull them out and we talk about them. And, you know, the difficulty, too, is that I can only say one word at a time. You ever notice that? Mm-hmm. I mean, I've sometimes tried to say the fullness of the whole thing. Like, you know, I write poetry. And the whole poem is what I'm trying to offer, not the individual words. So imagine for a moment, I was just fantastic. I could speak the entire poem in one word. Blah! Right? You get like kind of every letter of the alphabet, every word, every syllable, all banged together. It just doesn't work. Right? So in speech, I say one word at a time, and one word comes after the next word. And then you start to number them. And we go, the first one, and the second one, and the third one. And then sometimes we go of importance, you know, like the important thing is where we want to get to, and where we are right now is not so important. Right? So that's kind of like a really important one. And then there's kind of, so you've got at the beginning, there's Dana-parami. Right? That's it. Everyone knows it's nice to give and it's good and it's kind of ethical, all that kind of stuff. And Sila, parami, morality and all that kind of stuff. Bit of patience, yeah. And some skilled use of energy. I'm not quite sure what that is. And continuity of caring and inquiring, Samadhi and jhana and meditation and then wisdom. Imagine for a moment, though, we might look at each of these as if they're all, sometimes you see the 6 parami and it looks like Dana-parami. And sometimes you see the 6 parami and it looks like Sila-parami. You know, it's just kind of, but they're all there working. Right? So could we sit ourselves down into the fullness of the living that we are and see if we can explore generosity, giving, receiving. You've got nothing else to do. You just kind of sit down on the porch and you're hearing birds. And Sharplin will probably be having some verbalization, right? I'm trying to respond to your question, right? Hey. But can I kind of look at my experience, whatever it is, through the lens that somehow, can I see the generosity in this? The giving, receiving. Right? Generosity generates. It genetics. It genitals. Right? It gens. It's genders. It's there's a word here. Right? There's a word here which is like deeply connected with kind of fecundity and reproduction and bringing newness into being. Right? Imagine for a moment, sometimes, in my explorations, I found it very, very fruitful when I was trying to kind of wrestle with and see something in a new way, to set that aside and instead look at its absence. And sometimes that gave me a kind of a fresh view of what it is. So I'm not quite sure what I'm sitting down into the fullness of the living that I am, and I'm raising the question of generosity. I mean, I can only do this when the whole of my being is passionate about generosity. Not about the words, but the act. Right? This is raising the question. Okay? And I begin to kind of feel like how this kind of giving, receiving, right, is part of the generation. Like generosity is like generating the next moment. Right? Imagine the murmuration of all the starlings. It's like one moment it's a big clump, then it's a skinny little thread. It's like beautiful Sumier painting in the sky. Like all the different kinds of swirls and textures and densities. Right? Like everything's kind of... Imagine for a moment I was to sit there and none of the participants in this were willing to receive or give. That there's no generation, a generosity. Right? It wouldn't work. Right? Don't think of you could approach this from a kind of parikalpita perspective, because the generosity in terms of a dance of lumps. This lump is being generous to that lump. This lump is not being generous to that lump. I don't want to be generous to you, feeling really stingy to you, and I'm feeling really... But actually, when I'm being really stingy and nasty with you, I'm giving you something. I'm giving you stinginess and nastiness. The question isn't to give or not to give. The question is, what are we giving? How are we giving? Okay? What would it mean to just settle down? Sometimes I get in, I think, well, there isn't any other kind of meditation to do. Just settle down. I appreciate a few supports every once in a while. So, smiling, breathing, presenting, appreciating, right, through this lens, if you like, of Sila-parami or Dana-parami, right, generosity. Yeah. And think of some of the kind of givings that are, imagine for a moment the starlings moving, right? If they're not, in a sense, at that moment, able to be extraordinarily responsive and shifting. I want to go this way, and then all of a sudden, yeah, but I don't want to go that way. Imagine reluctant starlings in the thing. You're going along, you have this thing, I'm going to meditate, and your meditation turns into a great big think, and your meditation was a failure because you were just thinking instead of meditating. There's frustration, I can't meditate. Okay? Imagine just kind of, now we're thinking. Now we're not thinking. Now we're, right? And all the time, this is like there's something which is just so subtle and so unacknowledged in our culture gradually becomes almost visible, almost tangible. And that is the fullness of the living that I am is composed of all of this. And it's amazing. You watch these swirling murmurations of starlings and you just, it's so beautiful. And on the article that they sent me this morning, the photographer was saying that he was sort of alone in this place. I don't recall exactly where it was, in Denmark or in Europe or someplace like that. And then he met a person was there who he'd never met before, a woman who was also there to watch the birds. And, they'd never talked. And she just turned to him and there were tears streaming down her face. And she just said, "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Okay? We didn't have to start the meeting of, "Oh, what's your name? Where do you come from? What do you do? You got kids?" Whatever it is, the kind of the normal meeting, right? This idea that we could meet in just kind of open, like rawness. There's a kind of a rawness of honest openness. Is this mind? Is this heart? Is this? That's just names. But we could look at generosity of Dana-parami from the point of view of kind of individual beings. Like, I've got this, I can give so much to Oxfam, and I can give so much to them, and I've given enough there. No, I don't want to give here. It's like it's all kind of measured out. And I'm not critiquing it. That's just a way that we live. Right? But there's other ways that we live too. Okay? And imagine for a moment just sitting down and not looking at Dana-parami in terms of this cell giving to that cell, but it being the kind of, the Dana-parami is the paratantra, the kind of the murmuration, the movement, the continuity, the dancing, right? Right? And the whole darn thing is utterly beautiful, tear-bringing beautiful. I mean, have you ever burst out crying with beauty, in the face of beauty, when there's no one there and you're just meditating? I hope so. I mean, I do hope also that you've burst out with tears at the beauty of other beings and things and objects and situations when you've seen them and you've been touched to your core and it's just a welling up of emotion and feeling. But I'm trying to suggest that we could actually just get a glimpse of this dancing of generosity, right? Daily. I will train myself to daily give material support. There's material givings and receiving, emotional support, right? Whatever that is. And giving my life as a gift of an example of awakening in action to others. That we are, we inspire each other, like the birds kind of swirl this way and then swirl that way. And the research is speculating that maybe most of the birds got their eye on about 6 or 7 other birds. That's it. And they're responding to their buddies, right? But they're all, like I said before, our friends, circles of friends overlap, and so the whole thing ends up going like this. It's like the Mexican hat wave at the football game, I remember once I was what it was. It was a gigantic mass gathering like that, whether it was a football game or a music concert, or I can't even remember what it was. But they started doing this hat wave, and of course, being a practicing Buddhist, I was kind of slightly uncomfortable in this. It wasn't my scene at all, but I kind of went along there. Just, I'm not going to be standoffish. I'll sort of I sit there like this. And I'm just meditating, waiting for the main event to happen. And I'm watching these kind of hysterical people doing their thing. And this wave of things coming around. And the wave came around here, and I'm sitting there like this. And all of a sudden, I went, because my whole being went, I was holding my hands down, because I'm not going to do that. But I could feel my juices rising up with this wave that was going around and then coming down. Right? And you know, I mean, this is just a very... and people, why do people go to these big mass rock concerts and big mass football games and so on? You can watch it on TV and it's much quieter and more comfortable, right? But we don't, because there's something about being together, and I think it's like at a very deep level it reminds us of something which we generally forget, and that is that we are profoundly connected, right? And there we kind of unconsciously get a sense of this in our juices. It's not an intellectual idea. I'm an intellectual idea. I'm not going to do this. And then I realized this is not intellectual. My heart increased. You know what I mean? My breathing changed. My muscles started to raise my arms. You know, even though I'm not going to do that, because I'm going to be a meditator and calm and just observing or participating. Okay? And so, you know, we have societies in a sense that kind of, we egg each other on, right? We Eco-sattva, bodhisattva, we ignorant Eco-sattva, bodhisattvas, egg each other on, right? So we get a wave of fear, and then a whole lot of other people get waves of fear. And we get waves of anger and frustration and us versus themism. And we're all up into us versus themism. We're all into self-righteousism. You know, imagine for a moment a true sangha of bodhisattva, eco-sattvas, who actually kind of, like their behavior resonates with each other, a deepening sense of generosity and at homeness in the mystery, like or not even, you don't necessarily feel at home at this stage that we're talking about, but at least you have a kind of recognition that your home is in the fullness of the living that you are, and there isn't anywhere else you can be. There's a choicelessness about this. So I might as well become interested in it. You can just sit and feel your right forearm and experience it through the lens of appreciating generosity. And sometimes, right, we're appreciating it using words. We have a speculation of how my forearm is suspiciously and amazingly like my dad's forearm. And it's sort of more different from a frog's forearm. Or a bird's wing forearm. And so sometimes my meditation, I'm just there having a kind of an intellectual appreciation of a journeying of evolution, of interconnection at that level. Another day, I'm just feeling the pulse of my blood in my arm. Sometimes when we meet with our body this way, we get worried. Oh, it's pulsing. I mean, I don't want to, I'm going to make a joke out of this, but at the time it wasn't really a joking matter for the person who was involved. It was many, many years ago, and I don't remember who the person was, right? It was a retreat I was giving at Wangapeka, long, long, long time ago, and in the early 80s, and I was staying in an A-frame, and they knocked on my door at 2 o'clock in the morning. And I kind of, who's knocking on my door at 2 o'clock in the morning? So I got up, opened the door, and this person was standing there, and they were obviously absolutely having a panic attack or something, and they said, "My heart is beating." And I remember I said, "Good." I wasn't trying to be smarty or anything like that. It was just kind of like, right? But it's almost like sometimes when people meet with the natural functioning of their body, it's a panic because we're not used to it. It's my heart's beating, my arm is pulsing, right? My muscles are tensing and relaxing and tensing and relaxing. I went to the optometrist the other day for an annual checkup for my cataracts that are growing, and when I've noticed that when I'm feeling, my energies are feeling very dispersed and not, I guess traditionally you'd say kind of low energy, right? I'm tired, I'm kind of running out of power, and my vision starts going a bit strange, and I start seeing like sparks and all kinds of stuff, and everything starts becoming swimmy, like I'm looking through layers of oil, right? And I was saying to the optometrist, well, I'm not quite sure whether there's, I'm just mentioning this because, in case there's something wrong, but I sometimes suspect that what's happening is I'm also in a quiet space where I'm just noticing the way my eyeball actually works, instead of just focusing on the picture that results from the working of the eyeball. The eye is flickering, and you're getting saccades, it's moving all the time. You're getting a little bit of this, there's probably you edit everything out, and you get a still picture of the forest while you're walking up through the forest. And he thought a moment, and he said, "Oh, maybe you are." He said, "Not many people would think that way." Right? But we start to kind of look into just sitting. We're just sitting. We're eco-sattvas, and I'm sitting down. And possibly you don't have to do this, but it may come to your interest to look at your forearm, to feel your forearm, to explore forearming through the lens of generosity. And kind of immediately you want to add the other forearm. You may throw in some fingers too. And maybe you add a shoulder. I mean, but what I'm saying is you can look at things that you don't normally think of. Right? Can you extend this generosity from being just an ego act? Oh, I'm being generous today. I'm not being generous today. To seeing in a way like, thanks heart for a flood of oxygenated blood. Right? You wouldn't say that, but maybe the cells kind of metabolize in a way that is an expression of thanks, because when they don't have that, they metabolize in a different way. That's their expression of non-thanks. Right? Can you begin to hold the possibility that within this body there is an ocean of dancings of generosity? And you start to see that when you're sitting down to meditate, we have these kind of fixed ideas. Some people do, or I'll be honest, I do from time to time. I can't speak for you. Right? That this is not really good meditation, whereas that is. Okay? And we sort of have an idea of what generosity ought to be before we go in, and then we look for it. And as soon as we look for it, we also find ourselves automatically, simultaneously looking for its absence, because that's how we identify it. And imagine for a moment being generous towards your tendency to fixate stuff. Instead of giving yourself such a hard time in your meditation, imagine for a moment just being really interested in what's happening, instead of just chronically and continuously judging. You're not being generous enough, you're so stingy, Tarshan, you should be more generous. What about, there's all kinds of gifts you can give, like imagine for a moment that you were to give yourself and give and especially give others this extraordinary gift. It's called give the benefit of the doubt. Giving them the benefit of the doubt instead of whacking them, right? Just like the possibility, like what is this? And I'm not saying we can always do this, and lots of times we want to come in and interfere and make it go this way or that way. That's another thing. But just raising this question, this is like, this is part of Sila, of wholesome relating, right? It's almost like an internal physiology of wholesome relating is the dance of giving, receiving. My receiving from you is a kind of gift to you, right? And your receiving from me is a gift to me. The giving is the receiving, and the receiving is the giving, right? And where does it begin and end off, right? And could I cultivate a kind of a spirit of generosity, the mind of generosity, a kind of heart of generosity, right? When I'm walking, shopping, listening to the news, right? This is like my life. If I don't listen to the news, then that's not part of my life. But if I do listen to the news, then it is part of my life. Playing the guitar, blowing the flute. This whole theme that we're following, which is a kind of a universal expression of Dharma. Dharma from a universal perspective, right? What are the mycorrhizal fungi giving to the trees? And what are the trees giving to the mycorrhizal fungi, right? What about the gift of intellectual knowledge and the gift of feeling and the gift of appreciation and the gift of emotion and the gift of touch and the gift of just, right? Giftings. So we are all eco-sattvas, whether we realize it or not. All beings are eco-sattvas. Okay? When we don't realize our eco-sattva nature, our interbeing nature, our eco-sattva interbeing, interknowing nature, right? Problems emerge. If we really want to bring peace into the world, do we do this by getting others to live a different kind of political system or economic system or so on? Doesn't mean that that's not going to happen. But maybe we bring peace in the world. We find it's much closer. It's much closer at hand. That we begin to live peacefully. Right? We make peace with being the fullness of the living that we are, which embraces and has space for all the other participants. And we become sangha for each other. And as I live in this kind of thing, as the hat wave comes around, and I go, yes. And someone goes, yes. And we kind of almost like invisibly support each other by living more attentively, right? More directly. And so this was my attempt to say the same thing again. Okay? Are there any thoughts or comments or observations or questions that anyone would like to share? Stephen, if you could keep an eye on if there's anyone from the cyber world or the people, the flesh and blood ones in the room. If we can be generous and make space for our thoughts in meditation, gradually the thoughts, just as my visual experience can become more kind of translucent, and although I see the trees, I'm also open for all kinds of other, I'm not kind of fixated on it being a tree. I don't actually see the trees, I see a shape. I see shape and color, and it's constantly shifting and changing, and then I name it as tree, right? And so it's almost like if I'm appreciating this constant mirage-like shifting, I'm translucentizing it. I'm actively allowing that. I'm starting to feel at home in that. But could I begin to translucentize thoughts in a similar way? It's not like, there's this world of the five senses and I'm here and now with it and I got these thoughts as if they're... No, they're also just perception, conceptions that are arising. Translucentize. And if we can make space for them, slowly they become more and more translucent, and so they might quietly burble along, but they're not a problem at all. Right? And sometimes they're extremely useful. Right? And sometimes they don't have any use whatsoever. Right? And just kind of let it burble. Right? And I think it was Longchenpa once, in one of his writings on Mahamudra or Dzogchen, said, above all, don't go against what you do. Right? Most important, don't go against what you do. So in Mahamudra, there are no defilements because no war against defilement has ever been declared. It's another classic quote from a Tibetan text. Okay. And so we start to be generous towards our thoughts, generous towards, and in the process of getting interested in this, just more and more, the gift of my interest. The greatest gift maybe that we can give as individuals is the gift of our attentiveness. To really attend to this being, or to this being, or to this situation, or to this feeling, or this is a gift of attentiveness. And then there's other days when I'm stingy with my attentiveness. I'm only going to focus on a visual image of Chenrezig, and the whole of the rest of the world be damned. It's a bit silly, right? You're only really meditating on Chenrezig when the image of Chenrezig disappears, and the whole of the rest of the world is Chenrezig gone wild.
There's a question from Lorena.
Yes? Lorena?
You can unmute Lorena.
Can you, Lorena?
Yes.
I'm
Hello,
not.
Catherine.
Oh, hello. Good. I can see you now. Yes.
Hey, thanks very much for the chat. I've really resonated with lots of concepts that you have presented today. And one of them is this concept of eco-sattvas. So, and I want to go back to something you said at the end, that we are all eco-sattvas, whether we realize it or not. So I want to raise a question about whether people realize it or not. How is it possible to communicate this truth so that the biggest amount of people hear it, because I'm really hearing it today, but I'm aware that within the diversity of all that we are, everybody is going to hear it in a different way, and not everybody is going to hear it or resonate with it in the same way.
Yes.
So I look at that and I look at the world and I go like, so we just really need, I think, maybe the biggest amount of people talking about this in as many different ways as possible, so that the biggest amount of people can hear this truth. But I was wondering, what are your thoughts about, how do we bring this truth of goodness into everyone, or as much people as possible? What do you think about that? I was wondering, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I would like to consult the starlings. Just a minute, I want to bring back everybody. I'd like to consult the starlings. Right? When I'm a nature photographer, I'm not a starling, and I want to photograph the murmuration of giant flocks of starlings, so I can have a nifty website and I'll become a famous photographer. Right? This is not a critique of this wonderful work this Danish man has done. Right? And so I stand back and I want to see the whole of the swirling of the starlings. And imagine for a moment they're all swirling Eco-sattva. Right? This is great. How can I get them to all realize their Eco-sattva? Well, I mean, I haven't actually done this, but I could just imagine how silly I would look. I mean, I've done a lot of silly things in my life to, in the name of trying to come to deeper understanding, but I haven't even done, this one is more silly than, I never have stood out at one of these moments where I've seen the murmuration happening, massive flocks of birds all flying in formation, right? And I go, fly that way. Or, no, clump together here, or go faster, or go slower. And you can imagine I'm sitting there saying, really saying, be Eco-sattva, realize your true interbeing nature. And I got this hunch that they wouldn't listen to me. I get a hunch that nothing would happen. Actually, the murmuration is actually made up of individual starlings. And as best as we're sort of the best story that we've got going right now for ornithologists and biologists who are studying this phenomena is that, as I said earlier, is that on an average they might be noticing maybe 5 or 6 or 7 other starlings and kind of flying in formation with them. We did an exercise like this at Wangapeka years ago, and we had a large number of people up around the pagoda, and I think we called it the game, because we just had to have some kind of name for it, and we made it simple. You didn't have a relationship with 6 or 7. You had a relationship with 2 others. So you would choose 2 people, or maybe it was 3. But you don't tell them. There's like, imagine a whole field of people, right? They're all standing together. You select 2 people or 3 people, and mentally you figure out the distance between you, right? And then on the word go, everyone starts moving, but you don't know, like everyone's chosen different people. And what you try and do is you try and move so that you're always in the same, people are running around here trying to maintain their relationship with their own little group of people. It's a fascinating exercise, and it's a whole different exercise for the Tarchin who's instructing them to do this, because I'm standing outside of it and I'm watching this kind of swirling of human bodies making patterns that go faster or slower and so on. And nobody's organizing this. Right? Everyone's just got their little rule is that they have to stay connected with their local community. Right? So in a certain sense, I'm not sure that we can, I do appreciate the desire to help myriad beings awaken to their eco-sattva nature. But I think actually we actually do this by eco-sattva-ing with each other. And so, you know, if somehow our time together this morning has kind of spoken to you, as using your words, has touched you in a way that's meaningful, this is how you do it. That you then live in a way that touches other beings in a meaningful way. The beings in your life. You know, haven't you ever got together in a kind of an organization that's dedicated to some sort of compassionate work, which maybe requires organization, especially if it involves money raising enterprises and stuff like that, and you know, maybe and then you end up having disagreements amongst the people who are all working together to do this wonderful compassionate work. Yeah, can you imagine? Have you ever seen like people, you know, wanting freedom? They want freedom, and they march in front of the parliament. They say, "Hang the prime minister. We want freedom. Kill the enemy. We want freedom. We need peace in the Ukraine. What we'll do is send in more weapons." It doesn't work. And something which is like really important is to not get seduced into the seduction of big is good and small is inconsequential. And to really, and without necessarily letting go of the aspiration for the big realization, we are continuously rooting ourselves in the local aspiration. And can I treat my body as eco-sattva? You know, I'm living with a condition that's called cancer, and you know, when it started, I used to think of, you know, this kind of phrase, "Oh, you got cancer." Like there's a thing called cancer. You've got cancer. And then gradually, you know, in various researchings and living with this over the years, I've come to find out that actually prostate cancer is usually a community of 7 completely different types of cancers. And some of them, and they live in kind of like any other ecosystem. Some of them kind of repress each other, and some of them synergize each other, and they're kind of like, and so it's actually perhaps a kind of, how do I approach my healing? Do I get rid of the cancer? Or do I maybe, you know, like, can I do something to lower the population of this particular type of cancer because it's suppressing this other cancer? Because if I get rid of that one, if my treatment is entirely successful and I get rid of all that cancer, these other guys who aren't affected by the treatment, well, suddenly they're just running away. Can I work with it as an ecosystem? Can I work with my feelings as an ecosystem of like feeling and body and metabolism and genetics and relationships and so on, you know, like can I do this in such a way that is palpably visible to others around me? And in this sense, we encourage eco-sattva-ing with each other without even saying the word. It's just I don't want this to sound simplistic, you know, like never mind the big picture, just deal with the local. But I think that we, you know, they used to say, what would they say? Think globally, act locally, right? Well, I think actually it would be better to think locally and act locally. And the global will look after itself.
There's an interesting coincidence, Dutch, and here we are sitting in an area called Ongatete.
Yes.
And the translation of the word Ongatete is rolling cloud. and maybe even rolling cloud of birds.
Yeah.
Here we are in the midst of the rolling cloud,
Mm.
in Ongateti.
Mm. So you all over the world have joined us in Ongateti. I'd like to stop here. It's been a very hopefully useful morning, but it's been a full morning. Okay. Just again dropping into, falling open into this living that you are. And see if you can feel the aspiration to understand the world in terms of Eco-sattva, to understand your experience in terms of Eco-sattva. And sometimes you find yourself doing it through the lens of Dana-parami, generosity. And after a while we become more competent and confident in moving and living this way. By the power of these wholesome activities, may our lives be rich with awakening. Living thus, may we abandon all unwholesomeness. Throughout the endless mystery of birthing, dying, murmurating, whirling that this life and living, this interbeing is, may we help all beings to realize for themselves, not telling them, but helping them realize for themselves our true interbeing nature. Sarva Mangalam. Sarva Mangalam. Sarva Mangalam. Thank you all.